What's up, guys? Welcome to another edition of Before the Whistle, presented by BRK Insurance Group. If your business is looking for the best in employee benefits, commercial property and casualty insurance, or retirement and 401k plan services, there's no one better suited to meet your challenges and build a plan centered around your needs than BRK Insurance Group. What's going on, y'all? Happy Friday and welcome back here to Before the Whistle. I am your host, Maddy, and I'm fitting in one last episode here before Tulane hits the road one last time in non-conference play to try to win the state of Louisiana up against the UL Ragin Cajuns this Saturday at Cajun Field. It's going to be really exciting to see this team bounce back from what have been two really tough losses, but one that I think have really just kind of bred a lot of heart and fight in this team. Obviously, there's not really a silver lining when it comes to losing back-to-back football games, but there is an ability to see the forest for the trees here. And I think that this team really sees that for themselves. And the focus and the morale this week have really just impressed me. And that's kind of what I'm going to get into on this episode, is just the mentality of this team and how I've seen it really take form both on and off the field, and why I really think that matters more than a lot of the things that we've discussed on the field. But I know that there are some hot button topics here that I don't want people to think I have no interest in them or I'm skipping over them. I know that I wear a lot of hats. I have this podcast. I write for Sports Illustrated as one of the publishers for Tulane on Sports Illustrated. I'm also Tulane sideline reporter with the radio network. And that makes it just kind of in a position for me. I'm not, a typical media member here. So I'm not ignorant to the conference realignment stuff going on and everything that comes with that. I also don't have any insider information, just for what it's worth, to throw that out there. I think it's one of those situations where what I will say on it is the fact that these conversations are really centered around Tulane and Memphis being kind of this strength for not only their conference, but a pull in different conferences. That just says a lot to me about what Tulane as a program has really positioned themselves to be looked at. Just in conference realignment, it's been clear you have to adapt, you have to be ready for anything, and you have to be ready right then and there. Most of that comes from immediately being good at football. And when you look at the first really wave of realignment that hit the AAC with Houston, Cincinnati, and UCF going over to the Big 12, Tulane was in the midst of that Cotton Bowl year, but the year prior, they were 2-10. They were never going to be included in those conversations. So the fact that it's very clear they're operating from a little bit of a position of strength here, knowing that they position themselves as one of the top G5 programs, that to me has been the most important thing to take away here. For what it's worth, though, it is really distracting to even start talking about this, because as a broadcast member, I'm getting ready for this weekend. I'm trying to get the final things down for preparation for a broadcast, do some final stuff on the team, and pack for an away trip, and just really focus on what this team has to do in order to get another win before going into conference play and really just kind of bouncing back after two tough losses. This is kind of a mess in the middle of that. It unfortunately just is kind of what college football is. The other thing, too, to point to is the practice facility. The Tulane's athletic director, David Harris, he tweeted out this morning that they determined that the Brown Field wasn't a suitable location and that they're committed to completing the project. Again, without having any insider knowledge, being committed to completing the project. The other thing that has been discussed is the Claiborne lot. That to me would kind of be the first thing to consider when they're still looking to complete this project. But the reality is we've had a rough 2-week stretch for Tulane as in terms of practice facility, and having a hurricane hit and just a really tough rainstorm before playing Kansas State. That's just kind of life and football. And there are a lot of teams that you think about all of the snow delays for the Buffalo Bills game. Like, weather is to a degree a part of life when it comes to football. Obviously, I think the idea that fans expected kind of something to be completed by now, but what that kind of reads to me as that this isn't done yet. And if you're going to go for it, go big. That's just kind of my take on it. And that field wasn't really going to be a full-size field for this football team. The other thing that I think is important there is the consideration of the student body. And I know that there is a way to share it. But what I found really fascinating for Tulane has been the student buy-in has just completely taken on a different level throughout the season. And so to me, that really shows that everyone's kind of unified on this, that stays there for the students. This team is in the middle of the football season, and that's kind of all I have to say on those two things. I think that update was very necessary, though, just for the transparency of fans. But that's all out there, and I am back to prepping here for Tulane's game this weekend. I had a chance to watch the 2 Welcome to Uptown special that Tulane put out, and I think if you haven't followed along with this television special that they have, it's on ESPN Plus and YouTube, put on by the department led by Parker Peltier and that entire staff. It's really worth watching. It really shows just the human level that is so fascinating to me to watch, because if you ask me what the best trait is about Tulane football, it's always been the character of these guys. And that continues to ring through more than anything else. So that's something I'm really going to focus on today, because I think when you look at adversity and how those kind of things hit, I also think that you've seen this team just take on a different level of maturity and preparedness, and finally seeing all the talk about the legacy, the culture, everything that the Willie Fritz era really built here. This team has taken it and not only run with it, but it has been really just a pleasure to watch how this team really is just a bunch of fighters. And that's really what I'm going to break down today, as highlighted by these guys in their words themselves. To start off, I think there's something to be said about the titles of these videos that they put out for Welcome to Uptown, where obviously you are trying to come up with a catchy title, but what these 2 episodes were, which they dropped to being the hurricane delay. The first one, sorry, I have a hair that's stuck to the middle of my face. The first one was called Do Your Job. Saints fans around here will be very familiar with that saying. Sean Payton, that was the picture of him that hung in the facility the year that he was suspended. It was a picture of him with his pursed face that everyone's very familiar with during the Super Bowl with the caption, Do Your Job. I had interviewed one of the defensive linemen a few weeks ago, Aiden Huntington, and that's a position group I'm going to get to on this episode. And that was something that he had said, do your job and playing to our standard. So when this episode came out about their weekly philosophy going into Kansas State, that really resonated because I had interviewed him that week, and that's essentially really what he said. What I have kind of wondered about for Tulane was there was a 1-0 mentality under Willie Fritz. We've replaced kind of the core values, I suppose, with that idea of attitude, toughness, discipline, and love, something that really is clear in this team. But after 2 losses in a row, it is kind of a question. What is that ability to get over it? 1-0, it is something that came to be very unique to that Tulane team through that Cotton Bowl year, but it's a phrase a lot of coaches use. It's just the idea of it being at 1 week at a time kind of thing. I found it very fascinating that their adversity chant, if you will, is less on a game-by-game basis, and it's more moment-based. And I think that's really important to consider, because you can't exactly say 1-0 in the middle of a game. I remember that they would do the fourth quarter thing. That's something this team still does on the sidelines to start the fourth quarter. Everyone holds up 4 fingers and you go knock it. That was kind of something that you saw during the game, but there was no kind of in-game universal response to adversity like the one that I've seen under John Sumrall. And I had asked him about what the Jumbotron saying good and best were prior to the season starting. It was something I had stared at every day, just kept slipping my mind because 1-0 used to be up there. And good is the team's response to adversity. And he brought up an example of when they had played, I believe it was App State when he was over at Troy. First play of the game, their quarterback threw an interception. He, on his coach's headset, yelled good, and his team all did it behind him. I was kind of curious in that first game to see if we would really hear that be uttered and see that really take place. As critical as John Sumrall was of the team in their season opener, they won 52-0. There really wasn't real moments of adversity to be able to kind of see how they would respond. The Kansas State game, you started to see a lot more adversity hit this team, but you really saw it pile up against Oklahoma, where I talked about this a little when I did my breakdown of the show. But, here we are again. We were just talking about our travel plans for going up to UAB in Birmingham, where we stayed for the Hurricane Ida back in 2021. And that was the week of the Oklahoma game. Francine was not as disruptive. It's not even close, but it's still just another layer of adversity that this team has really had to deal with in these first couple weeks early on. And I've talked about how really impressed I've been by just the response of this team in those moments of adversity. And I have started to hear them utter good on the sidelines. And I really think that makes a difference, because the reality is yeah, you have to be able to set the slate after the fact, but there are going to be a lot of times in games where things go haywire. And Tulane went down 21-0 against Oklahoma. You can't really be thinking just one game at a time. At that point, you have to really have something that keeps your team focused and keeps them in that. And I really just think that despite this hurricane, you've seen them really take that opportunity to bond. Yes, they lost practice time together, but I think they really came out of it being a really, really close-knit team. And the chemistry that you could feel from these guys, the genuine friendships that are apparent across this program really speaks to just, I think, again, humanistic approach that John Summerall brings as a coach. I recall talking with him at AAC Media Days, and I'd asked him about his mentors, because I think that's always super important to know about a head coach. Going back to Sean Payton, just with the time I spent covering the Saints, you have to know Bill Parcells to really understand Sean Payton. And so that was one of my early questions, trying to get to know John Summerall as a coach. And he had a lot of answers for that as his time in his coaching career went on. But Mark Stoops really taught him the humanistic approach and to be less process oriented and results driven. And I've had coaches that are hard asses. It works a lot of the time, but sometimes it's tough on a team to have that kind of mentality in the middle of a game and be really concerned about the fact that your team is down 21-0. To be upset that a player like Bailey Despaney, even though I don't understand targeting, I just really don't get the rule at all. A lot of coaches could still get mad at a player for having a lack of discipline there. John Summerall was the first guy to embrace Despaney and then gave Bailey Despaney the Devin Walker Spirit Award that week for his demeanor on the sidelines. I think that says both a lot about a coach and a player. I think it says a ton about Bailey Despaney. I wrote an article on it this week about how he was even more impressive off the field after he was ejected early on in the second quarter. He had led the team in tackles. He had recorded 7,000 yards on the ground by the end of that game, trekking up and down the sidelines. It's something that I felt like a very kindred spirit with that comment, because I walk like 3 miles a game, just going back and forth. But it was cool to hear. It's very cool to hear these things in media and then have a very unique vantage point as a sideline reporter to go, oh yeah, well, I very much remember that. I remember him talking to Kevin Adams, who was the player that came in for him and tied him for second in team tackles with 9 total tackles, 7 solo each. Kevin Adams also had a tackle for loss. He had 1.5 tackles for loss the week prior. Just the next man up and the grit from this team, but really the genuine love has been the most exciting thing for me to cover as both a sideline reporter and on this forum in writing form. And that's, to me, what really gets you through hard times more than anything else. With this team, would have liked to come out of the stretch 3-0, of course. But I think where a lot of teams, especially ones that the leadership wasn't clear before the season started because it was such a new squad and you didn't have, again, an identity, a starting quarterback, a lot of answers. You have so many of these things in such a spread up and yet truncated period of time. And quite honestly, I think if not for the adversity, this team might be a little further back and really learning about each other and truly having that bond of love. And to me, that's more than a silver lining. To me, the most encouraging thing that came out of the Oklahoma loss was a very clear identity and firepower on defense. I brought this up at the end of my last episode on kind of that trending up category, but after going back and watching some of the film to write some articles for Sports Illustrated this week on Tulane's pass rush this last week, I walked away from it just that much more impressed, because even the plays where, the quarterback was still able to get the ball off, things still happened, they still made a play. When you looked at each guy on their one-on-one reps, they were winning them a lot more consistently than we've seen the last couple of weeks. Really, they weren't able to get meaningful pressure on Avery Johnson. Jackson Arnold was a lot more surprisingly mobile than we would have expected, but he was much more of a straight line kind of bully ball type guy. Reminded me a lot of the Virginia Tech quarterback that just kind of ran through Tulane's defense. Avery Johnson was very elusive, and his escapability just brought a different wrinkle. Where you looked at the pressure snaps for Tulane, they had 11 hurries on Avery Johnson, so they were able to get some pressure, but they didn't really have much to show for it. A lot of that by the fact that Avery Johnson was able to create plays on the run. Mobile quarterbacks, though, even though a lot of that credit goes to Avery Johnson, eventually you are going to have to stop them. And that's going to be something that is really something to watch for Tulane as the season goes on, just that kind of being somewhat of a noted issue for them. But Jackson Arnold also was a pretty mobile guy. The difference was they started to get a lot of interior pressure and pressure on the edge. when you're able to break through in both sides, it makes teams that have to game plan against you. Prior to this, it was largely, okay, well, Patrick Jenkins on the interior, and they had Devin Deal and Darius Hodges, Keith Cooper on the edge, but you were able to kind of replace that production with Aiden Huntington. Unfortunately, we were kind of looking at that bandit role and not seeing that much out of it. And the defensive line, to me, just had a little bit of a slow start to the season. Even guys like Patrick Jenkins, where you know what they're capable of, it just felt like the group was kind of coming together still. As I was watching this Welcome to Uptown special, they focused on the defensive line. Coach Landius Wilkerson, who I think really deserves a lot of credit here, because I think what you're seeing is just genuine coaching finally kind of starting to pay off in that way. What really stuck out to me was Adonis Freely spoke quite a bit and made an emphasis on how he's really made them go back to the basics here, where they're looking at their steps and their hand placement, taking the right steps to get off after the ball, how to get off their blocks, knowing how to get vertical, using that known ability, but just kind of going back to the basics there. You heard the term, the game slowing down for guys, also the term, playing fast. Those are pretty interconnected with one another. And when the game starts to slow down for guys, that's where you see the term play speed come in, where you have to have the athletic ability in order to do it. You have to have the mental processing in order to diagnose, whether on offense or defense, but you have to have the ability to put that together and actually make a play in real time. And I talked about this very early on in the show about kind of conscious versus unconscious things. It was Ross Jackson was my guest on the show. We were talking about eye contact with the camera. I've talked about my posture and how my posture was something that I was unaware of, the fact that I was slumping over to start a lot of these episodes. I probably still am. And that's just more of, I have a hunchback issue and I hit my head in Oklahoma. So my neck is a little squeezed right now. But the idea of doing something and then being kind of hyper aware that you're fixing it, and it eventually will become a subconscious thing. So that's kind of what the case has been with my eye contact, where that really at first I had to put a Post-it there. It's something that comes with time. That long-winded analogy to say, I think that's what you're seeing really take place on the defensive line here. When I interviewed Aiden Huntington, when I watched his film, he's the transfer over from ULM Monroe, not you. Yes. There's a lot of acronyms going on with Louisiana schools in my head. I had watched his tape against Ole Miss, and I remember thinking, wow, this guy is really violent and causing issues for them. When I spoke with him the other week, it almost blew my mind when he told me that he really had no understanding of pre-snap alignments, of those pre-snap keys, tendencies, things that tip you off. And he was basically just going off of raw ability, but he was also doing a lot of his own research on PFF and researching quarterbacks, researching his opponents. For what it's worth, when I have been working through the Scouting Academy, I've read a ton of coaching books. And one of the ones on pass rushing, you have to be able to do your own self-research and look at opponents and do things like calculate a quarterback set point. You can only do that yourself by watching his tape, watching on, 3rd and 7. How many steps does he take on those dropbacks? What's kind of his average dropback there? A coach can tell you those things, but it's not the same as if you're doing it yourself and then being able to really apply that in a game setting. So knowing that a guy like Aiden Huntington has that in him, and then knowing that you have a coach here that's really taken the time to go back to the basics, it really, to me, colors a lot of the early struggles that you saw, but also very much a concerted breakthrough. It wasn't just one player that all of a sudden was getting off against Oklahoma. You saw consistent pressure. You saw it in critical moments. You saw them have, I believe, 6 tackles for loss. They had 7 hurries, and those resulted in a lot of third down stops. They also had 3 sacks after having 0 last week. And that just really can't be understated when they came from both the interior, the exterior, and a linebacker, because that makes it, again, teams have to respect both levels of the field now, having those credible blitzing linebackers. We saw them bring pressure with Dixon Agu as well. Shaquem Leister has been a problem out there, but Javon Carter just continues to be a very intriguing guy to watch for me. And it's a position group that I'm really looking forward to seeing how they operate this weekend, because I think once they start to kind of see it for themselves and get after it, you saw that happen in real time in the game against Oklahoma, where they were having trouble, if quite frankly, all season to get to the quarterback. But usually what you see happen with group of 5 teams, smaller level teams, when they go and play these big Power 5, Power 4, whatever schools, the ones that are very outsized, eventually you'll see somewhat of that start to set in the 4th quarter. You saw it in USF versus Alabama. They gave one hell of a fight through 3 quarters. Unfortunately, things just kind of went away at the end of the game. What I found fascinating was Tulane got better as the game went on, and where a lot of teams that are the undersized team would start to kind of falter, they got better and kept going. And I think the speed of this team can't be ignored. Both the literal speed on the field, which I think makes up for a lot of perhaps that size differential, but also the speed of the game in which they played the last 2 weeks. But just to kind of round that off with why I think there's a lot of potential here with the defensive line, to me, the key to victory in this game for Tulane is not beating themselves. And pre-snap penalties and just penalties in general have been an issue for them. And it's been really weird almost because for being you have to be a very disciplined team in order to mount the comeback that they did last week when you're in a 21-0 deficit and have the adversity happen, the stupid score against Kansas State, having that stuff go wrong in the Oklahoma game, but both games back to back. The defense keeps holding the 3 and out. The offense keeps driving down the field. It's been incredible, and that requires a ton of discipline. So it's been a little spellbinding to see the penalty issue for this team. I think a lot of that is young guys that haven't had much time on task together, and it's hard for me to separate or perhaps not separate the environment of last week with some of those penalties. So that's something I'm really going to be looking at this weekend. Just looking at last week's game, there were a few false start penalties on offense. There was a few illegal formations and 2 offsides calls on defense. But that stadium, you couldn't even hear your own thoughts. For me, the hold in the back, the block in the back on special teams and holding call, those kind of things just can't happen. But all in all, the defensive line has been a very, very disciplined group. And while they got 2 offsides penalties in this game from Aiden Huntington and Angelo Anderson, kind of back to back, that was a very, very loud stadium. And quite honestly, they weren't that quiet when their team was on the field. It was bizarre. But they had spoken about in that special, Landius Wilkerson really emphasized discipline. So I wanted to go and just look at the penalties this season. Tulane has had 25 penalties this year. The offensive line has kind of been the most of that, amassing 8 penalties. There's 3 kind of team penalties of a false start not attributed to anyone, a delay of game, that was the entirety of the offense. Defensive backs have 3, and the wide receivers, there's a few there, but there's only been 2 on the defensive line. The defense has not had too many penalties to me, and those first 2 were the first 2 by defensive linemen all season. I just feel like the discipline in that group is really strong, and they are backed up by very disciplined, strong players in Tyler Grubbs and Dixon Agu. But I just think when you start to break through in a pass rush like that, that to me is a key to victory. But not having every single offensive drive be stifled by a bunch of needless penalties is going to be really important for Tulane going into conference play, where there are a lot of eyes on them right now. As much as I said, I can't really talk that much about the situations with all these conferences. The reality is you want to be a winning team because whatever wave happens in which direction, the fact of the matter is you want to be on a position to get on the boat and make sure that you are an attractive one to kind of get on wherever that might be. That might include staying in the American and being that top dog. But all of that really starts with a win this weekend and really just kind of re-solidifying this team as championship contenders, where there's been some losses for Tulane the last couple of years. It felt like the Ole Miss game was a little more in just kind of the peripheral of discussions that season, where it does truly feel as if these games against Kansas State and Oklahoma are really in the rearview mirror for this team. They're so rejuvenated, and really, this is such an important win for John Sumrall, winning the state of Louisiana, but just really bouncing back as a team that I think is very, very close. And that says a lot about the culture, the coaching staff, but really about these guys, both the guys that chose to stay here and the guys that chose to come over here. There was a lot, it was almost like a pile of putty, if you will, where there's a lot of potential there to build something great. But yes, there was a culture and a legacy of former teams to fall back on, but this team hadn't proved themselves really until the season started. Now I think that they've really not just proven themselves to people watching, but proven to themselves that they belong and they really are a close-knit team that's truly a group of brothers and one that really loves one another. And if that's something that you can already say about a team through 3 games in which they've only won one of them, that's really, to me, what makes or breaks a championship contender. And with that, y'all, let's go get a win, and I will see you next week.